We're looking at board expectations and constituency expectations, and we're also looking at engagement differently. So the board of even 5 years ago, pre-COVID, those roles and responsibilities have evolved. And lastly, the charitable giving landscape is changing. And there are workshops later about fundraising, so I'm not going to do a deep dive into that. But we have to be transformation agents as board members. We have the courage to call out what's not working, challenge the status quo without ruining everything. So that's a really significant change. So why do you serve? And Karen and Deb already talked us through this, but committed to the mission, committed to community, and it's part of your personal core values. This is my favorite book of all time, Leadership is Governance. At the dawn of time, when I was first in the nonprofit sector in 1975, Peter Drucker had just come on the scene, management by objectives in corporations. Management, not governance, management by objectives. So Francis Hesselbein, the then CEO of Girl Scouts of the USA, met up with Peter and brought Peter's philosophy to the nonprofit sector. Management by objectives, not governance by objectives. And I worked with Girl Scouts. Francis Hesselbein was one of my early heroes. But I think they didn't do us a favor because it got too granular. As a Girl Scout executive staff member, I had to write a report for the board of directors every Friday to tell them how many troop leaders I met with, how many girls were in each troop, what I was doing about that. That should have gone up to my boss. So, pendulums tend to swing. John Carver is the next to arrive on the scene. Is anybody familiar with the work of Carver? So John Carver had this thing called policy governance. Sounds great, right? So you adopt a policy, and the policy might be the CEO has to run the agency within 5% of revenue and expenses, within 5% of participation, within 5% of employee compensation claims, whatever it is. So all he or they had to do was go into the boardroom and say, I'm in compliance with this. So we've got Drucker saying micromanage operations, and we've got Carver saying abdicate all responsibility for having a clue what's going on. Chait, Ryan, and Taylor, in my opinion, knitted it all together. They will say, this is not new, it's blended. And if you buy one book, and if you're on your phone right now with Amazon, that's okay with me. If you buy one book, this is the one. And their research was introduced in 2005, which I realize in research here it says like, when the earth was still grueling. But it's a blended approach. And I think it's brilliant. And their research was funded in part by BoardSource. You'll see the BoardSource logo at the bottom. But when you look at Chait, Ryan, and Taylor's model, this is what a high-impact board does. They understand there are 3 modes of operating. Fiduciary, notice it doesn't say finance, it's fiduciary. I like to characterize that as we can pay all our bills and we're in compliance with everything. Then in between we've got strategic. I think that's where every board thinks they're headed. Strategic leadership, in my opinion, my paraphrase is, we know what our work is and we are best in class in our space. Generative is, we know what our constituencies 10 years from now are going to want from us. And we're on a trajectory to evolve so that 10 years from now, we are best in class in our space. Now, pretend you have the most generative board on the planet, and it's March of 2020. You want to snap back to fiduciary to keep your people safe. This is not linear. It's simultaneous. And you have to know which sphere you're functioning in. But if the only thing you're doing is how good can we be today, and in your board discussions about what does the future look like, it's not next year, it's a decade from now. You're missing the opportunity to have generative conversations.
Aren't those two kind of connected though, like a lot in your strategic plan?
Maybe. It really depends upon how much your work is going to evolve. So I spent part of my career working in child welfare. At the time, HMOs were coming into popularity, and we typically had a troubled youth come to our residential program for 2 years. HMO said, you got 8 weeks. So what did some of the staff say? You're gonna love this. We gotta lobby the insurance companies to get them to understand they gotta give us 2 years. That didn't go so well. Instead of thinking generatively, how can we deliver the same kind of service but in a radically different model imposed on us by external forces? So it can be, but it might not be. Here's what you're doing. You've got oversight, you've got insight, and you've got foresight. And it's not sequential. It can be simultaneous. And in my opinion, and in their work, these are the massive benefits of adopting governance as leadership. Your board is empowered. They are this huge, amazing think tank. And if all they're doing is sitting in meetings, listening to your report on what the staff did in the past, you're missing the opportunity to really exploit their talent and engage their brains. Now, not every meeting is going to be a generative kumbaya session. On the Housing Partnership Board, our first meeting of the year is always the mandatory documents, looking at schedules. It's the stuff nobody cares about, but it has to happen. But other than that, we spend 20 minutes of every meeting talking about a thorny or amazing opportunity. And we freed up that time by using consent agendas. And everybody is responsible for submitting their reports in advance. We are responsible for reading them, calling our board colleagues if we have questions. We're not listening to somebody yammer on about what the governance committee did. They read it. So you really exploit the board talent, and it's more fun. The board members have more fun because they're doing what they want to do. And as a result, the board performs better, and so does the organization. So, fiduciary, strategic, and generative, get the best out of everybody who you've recruited. Questions about this? Obviously, this isn't a how-to, this is a why. But when you read the book, and you email me and we have coffee together, we can talk about that. But this, in my opinion, is huge, and it's transformational. Building a competent board, and you're gonna see all these things in most of the workshops you go to. So right now, we're talking about building a competent board. So what are some of the things that you as directors really need to be thinking about? Obviously, this is fiduciary, right? This is the making sure you can pay the bills and you're in compliance with everything. How are you helping the directors understand all of their accountability from a narrow legal perspective? So when you think about that and when you talk about that, how is your board orientation reinforcing all of these invisible things? Remember, we didn't grow up with this as our family DNA. So how do we transmit this to new directors? A really good board orientation. The median nonprofit, there's a woman at Rutgers, a researcher at Rutgers, I meant to look up her name and I forgot, I apologize. But a researcher at Rutgers who's looking at critical mass in the nonprofit sector, the median, half above, half below, staff size of US nonprofits today is 4. That means half of the nonprofits in the US are operating with 4 or fewer staff. I think that's mind-boggling. Makes me wonder who want to merge with whom to make sure they have more critical mass, but I realize that's not a popular opinion. But you have to perform your duties in good faith. You have to perform your duties in the best interest of the corporation, not yourself or a subset. You have to use reasonable inquiry skills and diligence as a person of ordinary prudence. Hopefully your nonprofit has directors and officers insurance. That obviously doesn't protect you if you've been negligent. But if you're doing all these things and doing them appropriately, it does help. But that also means asking good questions. The consent agenda thing. If somebody has a question for me about what governance is up to, they call me up, we talk about it before the meeting. Now, if you've got something you think the full board needs to talk about, then when the consent agenda is reviewed in the board meeting, you ask for it to be removed so that it can be a discussion point. And if your board's not familiar with using consent agendas, that's a different workshop. But it frees you up to do generative discussion. Questions about this business judgment rule? And ask yourself, how many of us really understand that? How many of us have talked about that in board recruitment, in board vetting, and in board orientation? The next one, legal and ethical integrity, still fiduciary, right? So you're talking about the duty of care, loyalty, and obedience. Those are the three big legal ones. And when you look at this, how the duty of care, informed judgment. Do you have the right fact set? Who's informing the background of the decisions you're making? And do you need more information to gain clarity? It is not shameful for a board to defer a decision if the board as a collective doesn't think it has enough information. Going along to get along isn't necessarily a good thing. So think about, if the bright light of scrutiny were shined on the decision we're making today, are we making the right decision for the right reasons? And do I really have enough information to know what I'm deciding on? So, independent professional advice. This is an interesting one, isn't it? Because boards approve budgets. Budgets are policy documents, right? Oh, they're board policy. But if the board wants more legal advice or more professional advice, where does the decision to find the money to do that usually reside? Where would it reside in your agency if you decided you wanted expert advice outside of that you've been provided by a committee or staff? Where would that question go?
To the board.
What-
Executive director.
Executive director, where else could it go? The board, but what specifically on the board?
Finance.
The finance committee. Has your board ever asked for that? And if you had a really thorny discussion, you probably should. And the executive director might be the right place, might be the wrong place. Because changing budgets is a board decision. Now, we're all smart enough to know the finance committee can't randomly go rogue and decide to spend money you don't have. But at the same time, deferring a discussion until you have the information you need, that is a responsibility of boards.
All right, question. We had recently a complex legal debate. We have a couple lawyers on our board, and we asked them to research it for us and come back with advice. I have a friend on the board who said we probably should go on to an outside attorney. Is there a view on that?
We have all these experts in the room. What would you have done?
I work for the Bar Association, and my guess is that the attorney on the board, I'm not an attorney, the attorney on the board may feel as though if they give something that is later on considered poor advice, that it could fall back on their malpractice insurance, which they hold as a professional, and they don't want to accept that personal and professional liability, would be my guess.
You would say go outside.
Well, I think it depends.
If
on
they're
the-
uncomfortable
It
with
depends on the nature of the issue, right? I am an attorney, but if securities was the topic of discussion at your board meeting, I'm not a securities attorney, right?
Right.
I would seek outside advice on that.
Is it
right?
So what's your area of practice? In law school, you got exposed to everything, but then you've spent your career in a focused area. So another one?
No, I agree with you 100%. It really depends on the situation and how thorny it is and how specialized it is. Because you may even have an attorney that is an attorney for the, say for instance in my case, university, but if they're not an employment attorney, for certain things, we've got to get an employment attorney. So I agree with the woman up in front there that it really depends on what it is.
I've also heard from attorneys and insurance carriers that if you're not actively practicing, meaning that board member is not charging the nonprofit, the insurance company wouldn't pay out, even if they were acting in their best interest. So it gets complicated quickly.
Don't you love America? What's interesting to me is, and your point, is that their practice area. And to your point, what's the depth and thorniness of this? I've already told you, I serve on the board of the Housing Partnership. They let me be in charge of the governance committee. We really needed to redo our bylaws. We didn't pay outside counsel to read our bylaws. We had an attorney on the board at the time who was said, yes, this is my area of practice, and we didn't need a lot of changes. It wasn't a complete rewrite. I suspect if we'd done a complete rewrite, she would have said, no, hire somebody to make sure you're not going down the wrong path. But I think that's one of the pitfalls we have. And you raised a legal question, but what about the other areas of expertise where we might expect someone to say yes, and they really ought to say, I'll pass. But if you're doing good prospect identification, vetting, qualifying, you make that clear before they even consider saying yes. These are the roles and responsibilities we need. Will you do that with us? I like to think of skills, abilities, attributes, and willingness. Test the willingness, because if you don't ask that question, and Karen already alluded to this, you could wind up with a finance person on your board who doesn't want to be on the finance committee. But independent professional advice, and then I think that probably needs to go back to the finance committee and perhaps the finance and executive committee. Why do we need additional expertise, and how are we going to pay for that? Because if you leave it entirely up to the executive director, especially if it's one of those scenarios where the board thinks they report to that position, the answer is probably going to be no. And it might need to be yes. So looking again at the duty of care, two facets of legal compliance: accurate information and reporting systems, the 990s. When I work with boards on board self-evaluations, oftentimes the one variable that is lowest rated is the board sees and signs off on the IRS 990 form. Well, the truth is, they have seen them. They have approved them. They didn't know what they were looking at. So when the survey says, did you sign off on the 990s? They don't realize that's what you did as the second stage of the audit. So part of it is making sure people understand what they're doing. And when you have a legal concern, making sure that board members are aware of that. There's no shortage of nonprofits that are being sued continuously. Some are frivolous lawsuits. I was talking to Chris Manna, the executive director of the New Kennett Library, and they have a constant revolving lawsuit problem with people who want to sue them for having particular books on their shelves. And I'm like, really? He said, yeah. And that is coming from people who think they're acting on behalf of the best interests of the citizenry. But of course, the library board doesn't agree with that. And at the same time, they still have to defend themselves. So the board being aware of what's going on. So looking at the duty of loyalty, board members are not benefiting personally by being on the board. This is a huge thing. It's interesting. I personally believe that you can have people on your board whose companies have relationships with what you do. As long as your conflict of interest policy is clear, the board member in particular is never involved in a decision that would bring a benefit to the company, and the conflicts of interest are clearly declared. There are probably people in this room who think that's ridiculous, that I'm absolutely wrong. The linchpin is, do you enforce the policies that you have? At the Housing Partnership, our board agenda, the very first thing after the call to order is declaring conflicts of interest, if any exist, with business on our agenda. So it's very clear. And it's not a shock then if somebody says yes. It hasn't happened yet, but in a board I worked for it did, where we had someone who was involved with an organization that my employer was trying to buy property from. So that board member had to recuse himself and be out of the room, and the minutes recorded that. So I think you can do it. but you have to be willing to enforce your structure. And if the board doesn't have the stomach for that yet, then yes, you can't have that. If you don't have a comprehensive conflict of interest policy that's signed annually, that's a thing to work on. The Minnesota Association of Nonprofits has a really good template. So if you're looking for one that's good and you don't have one, they have a good one.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Minnesota Association of Nonprofits.
May I also suggest too, if you're considering board members, that they know they're going to have to sign that document.
Absolutely.
So they really see it in advance and they understand, because that can be surprising.
Absolutely. Anything that your board members have to sign annually, they need to see way in advance. The board position description, the conflict of interest statement, the whistleblower policy, the housing partnership, we also adopted a code of ethics that everybody has to sign. So anything, they've got to see it, in my opinion, by the second conversation. Thank you for raising that. Confidentiality. Board meetings aren't secret unless they're executive session where they're closed. But how many things get derailed because somebody casually said something that wound up being a real speed bump? It could be confidential acquisition of real estate, for example. Negotiating leases, hiring people. I mean, board meetings are not secret, but there's a high level of confidentiality until things are public. The duty of obedience. Fiduciary. Don't break any laws. But think about restricted gifts. You get money earmarked for a particular thing, you're in a bit of a cash flow crisis. Do you play the float with the restricted money because you don't need to spend that for 3 or 4 months? It's not ethical. And if you don't understand that's what's happening, you can't stop it. So there are nuances to this. And obviously faithful for the nonprofit's vision and mission. And again, they're all sitting in that fiduciary space. But in looking at this, you're really looking at governance, fundraising, management, and direct service volunteers. I truly believe that we undervalue direct service volunteers in this country. People who want to be in operations. I'm a life member of Girl Scouts. I'm a volunteer for my granddaughter's troop. That's this. I'm a direct service volunteer. I love that. I don't want to be on their board. I want to play with the little kids in the woods. But the interesting question is there a prestige pecking order in your organization for the people who are governing board members, because they're so important, and the direct service volunteers, because without these people, you wouldn't have an organization. Think about something like Habitat for Humanity, Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, the Red Cross. All those organizations have lots of boots on the ground, and do we treasure them well? And if your organization has them and doesn't, rethink that. And it isn't always to identify people who will move up. They may be very happy staying there. And I know you're going to hear a lot more about fundraising today, depending on what you go to. And management volunteers are kind of a bridge. People who, at the Housing Partnership, we're working on that, creating essentially a think tank of professionals who we can run thorny issues by, who are willing to advise us. They don't want to govern, they don't want to do day-to-day stuff, they really just want to be a resource. So having all of those. But let's talk about the governance deep dive, because that's where, in my opinion, this is the power committee on the board. Because they are the ones identifying the people who will influence the future. So, governance committee, not a nominating committee. And I'm not going to ask you to admit if you still call it nominating. But I am a nut job about the power of words Nominating, in my opinion, is putting names on a ballot. It's 90 days before the annual meeting. We got 4 empty seats. Who are we gonna get? Governance is year-round. It's a dynamic process that looks at all aspects of who sets the future direction of your work. Because it's not the staff. Well, in some organizations it is. But it ought to, at best, it should be a collaboration. In a healthy organization, it's a collaboration. So the governance committee is responsible for all aspects of the operation of the organization's governance process on an ongoing basis. Obviously, some of these functions are more mission critical than others, and those are the ones I put in bold. Regular review and update of board job descriptions, committee structure, and committee charges. We're about to go through a deep dive at the Housing Partnership because our committee charges are kind of fluid, they aren't all the same structure, and we're probably going to wind up with a committee member position description that's a complement to the board position description. Because we're at the point now where we're inviting non-board members to serve on committees. And that is a healthy progress, I believe. Ensure ongoing evaluations of meeting effectiveness and board performance. Personally, I'm a fan of the board source board self-evaluation. And has anybody gone through that? You have?
A similar one, yes.
Okay. In my opinion, it's amazing. It's very comprehensive. It is structured around the 10 essential responsibilities of nonprofit boards. It's digital. You get a hyperlink and everybody fills it out. And it can be a very powerful tool for setting a baseline. And if you've not done an external objective board self-evaluation, in my opinion, don't pay somebody like me that has a proprietary one. Use a big one that can compare you with data sets. The New Hampshire Center for Nonprofits also has one. It's not as detailed as the board source one. But you don't do it every year like a financial audit. But you do it at times such as transition to a new board chair, transition to a new CEO or executive director. If you've come out of a speed bump and you want to set a baseline, but what is the objective, effective measurement you have of what you're doing, how you're doing it, and what you're not remembering? And that's the thing I was referencing earlier. The thing in my experience, my clients will often hire me to help them figure out what to do with the data. The number one lowest thing is always, we approved the 991. That's easy to phrase. Timely distribution of confidentiality statement, conflict of interest, disclosure, all those things we were just talking about. Board position description, whistleblower policy, conflict of interest. I like to add to that the estimate of annual contribution. Do it in January. People have till December, but at least they're going on record saying, I know I need to do this. I know I want to do this. I know this is an accountability I have as a director. And then, as I mentioned, we've also adopted a code of ethics. Notice nominating is just number 10 of all the accountabilities. So if you're still calling it a nominating committee, I'm here begging you to think about, are we selling ourselves short by thinking it's only the body count? So this are the nominating subset of the role of the governance committee. So first of all, it is an integrated role. It is not a standalone function. It's an integrated role. It's not a standalone function. So how do you analyze the board? Someone in the plenary session this morning talked about a board matrix. Absolutely. Who have we got? How long have they been serving? And what are the essential skills, abilities, and attributes that we know we need on this board? And where are the deficits? Maybe it's in age, maybe it's in gender, maybe it's in what part of the county or the region someone lives in. Maybe it's in hard skills, like law, or real estate, or HR, or marketing, or philanthropy. If you're faith-based, do we have a broad array of congregations involved in our work? So that skill set, skills, abilities, and attributes is going to be different for every organization. So what do you have, and how do you look at what's missing? How do you look at what committees need more support? So are there particular skills, Karen's comment about, we got a bunch of finance people, but they don't want to be on the finance committee. That's where if you were to have this conversation with us, is this a skill you'd be willing to use? I like to have 3 continuous lists. On paper, not in the cloud. I know that sounds very analog, but that's because of this. People you looked at who aren't appropriate. And I want to make sure we keep a list of potential board members, people who've said no to us or deferred because of whatever's going on in their life at the time, and people we vetted and we said their motivation to serve, their orientation to our mission is incompatible with the culture and the work we want to do. So I think the experience of identifying and vetting candidates is at least a 4-month process. Number 1, you finished your assessment, you know what you need, and you're identifying people who fit that role. Who are you having discovery conversations with? And a discovery conversation isn't recruitment. So I had the pleasure this morning of sitting next to Eric, and let's pretend I called him up and I said, I chair the governance committee of the Housing Partnership. Would you be willing to have a conversation with me about people in your circle of influence who might have our mission at heart? So he says, yes. We meet at Griffin or Mayday, we have a coffee, and he gives me a punch list of people. Maybe some of them are people already on my not appropriate list. I'm not going to tell them that. They stink. We're never talking to them again. Or deferred. I might share that. We really did try to recruit so-and-so, but at the moment, they're on our deferred list. But he might give me a couple of names of people I don't know, I don't have access to. Would he be willing to open that door or call and set up my conversation? That next conversation is not a recruitment conversation. It's a discovery conversation. I don't know if you've heard about us. Would you give me the opportunity to tell you what we're doing? Maybe yes, maybe no. We get yes. Again, we go for coffee someplace, and I take the mission program information to that meeting. And I say, this is who we are, this is what we do, this is why Eric thought you might be a good fit. Would you be willing to take this conversation further? I'm not asking you to decide today. Let me give you a few days to think about it. 3 or 4 days later, I call them up and I say, I promise to call you back. What are your questions? Not, do you have questions? Because no, I'm smart enough not to have any questions. What questions do you have? Maybe a few. Would you be willing to have another conversation? At that point, if the answer is yes, 2 other members of the governance committee take over. Because he's already met me. She's already met me. They've already met me. They didn't need me again. So this is when the compliance documents go. All of them. If we show them those papers, they'll never say yes. If we don't show them those papers, it's bait and switch. I've never had anybody say no because of the papers. I'll tell you where no comes in a minute. So 2 more members of the governance committee go, they have coffee with the person, or, happy hour, depending on. And after that meeting, same thing. Let me give you a few days to think about this. When they say, yes, I'm willing, then we invite them to shadow a full board meeting. They get the packet, except the confidential stuff, and they are a full participant in our board meeting. 3 or 4 days after that, I call them, because I'm chair of the committee, I call them, and I say, now that you've seen how we make the sausage, what are your thoughts about moving forward with this? There are a lot of places for you to say, I'm not sure they're going to be good for us. Or for them to say, I'm not sure I like the culture of this organization. But by doing it sequentially, you can see how it can take 4 months. And then, when they say yes, They get elected, and between the election meeting and their first meeting as a director, there's full-blown board orientation. Not conducted by the staff. Because they're on the board, they're not on the staff. Now, we do it at our building, so they can meet the staff. But it's very clear, the staff is not in the orientation. Yes?
Robbe, can you talk about guardrails in terms of that third, those are not appropriate people? If you have a board member who really wants somebody on the board and they're pushing them through that process, what are the guardrails that you put in place to make sure that you can say no to that person?
We don't let board members champion someone without rationale. And I think if you're pushing a particular person, that would be kind of a red flag discussion for us in our governance committee meeting. Why is this person being championed? And there's this philosophy that every board member should be recruiting their own replacement. Every board member should be referring potential candidates to the governance committee, but not necessarily recruiting their own replacement. And I have to wonder sometimes if that mindset comes from, it's my job to fill my seat. So if you're really looking at governance as a holistic thing, not nominating, I've got to fill my empty chair, that may diminish over time, but it can be a thing. But if you've got a really strong governance committee and you're working through the steps methodically, I think that can fade, if not disappear.
Sounds like something that should be part of the code of conduct too.
Well, the board code of conduct, maybe.
I mean, not specifically that line, but
Yeah.
we're here for the good of the
Well, and the
organization.
board roles and responsibilities include referring people to the governance committee, not filling my empty seat. So I think part of it is that language, yeah.
So how do you brought somebody into this process and then you determine that they're not a good fit? How do you terminate the process then? You know, like,
In my experience with this, it's kind of mutual. That what you're asking them to do and what they're willing to give is incompatible. And it could be as simple as the time of day of your meeting. And in that case, we had that situation with Housing Partnership, and that person's twice now on a committee because the time of day we meet doesn't work with their family. But I think if you're having a critical conversation about what skills you need, what abilities you need, and what you're expecting of people in the first meeting, you can pretty much figure that out without making an enemy. I'm not sure I answered your question.
no.
I'm not sure you believe me. But
And it isn't easy, but one of the things I've seen that works really well is at the very beginning of the process, the individuals know that the process doesn't mean you're on the board. So that,
Yep.
and to talk about it as a mutual agreement. So they're interviewing us too, is how we look at it, so that conversation flows.
You're absolutely right. And the idea that just because we start the talk doesn't mean you're going to be on the ballot.
I think it's kind of similar to like any other, like you were mentioning, hiring somebody, you're interviewing. The same way, if we went with another candidate, there was somebody else who we felt kind of, but they have to know, like you said, that it's just because you're here to review everything doesn't mean it's for you. It's got to be a mutual fit, and we're allowed to go with someone else.
I don't know about you, but I'm a fan of the writing of Malcolm Gladwell in his book Blink. And my very, very, very brief paraphrase of Blink is trust your gut. And why you should trust your gut. And when that chemistry meeting doesn't go well, trust your gut. And that doesn't mean you don't have the second team interview the person if they think the person should be considered. But what you don't want groupthink on a board. You don't want people who all come from the same philosophy. You want people on a board who will treat each other with dignity. And even if you're challenging each other, that you do it not with your self-interest, but with the best interests of the people you're serving or the mission you're serving. So it can be awkward and difficult, but better to have it awkward then than have to remove someone from a board later, which is really bad.
I'm curious what your perspective is on there being terms.
Oh, I believe in terms. Every board has terms. I think what you're asking is, do we have term limits? Can you serve a fixed number of terms? Every board I work with that has term limits wants to get rid of them, and the other way around. In my opinion, in this day and age, when people think in finite years, endless terms is not something people are going to want going forward. But at the Housing Partnership, we went through that. We went from serve until you're dead. Well, and Chris and I worked together in an organization where that was the rule. And it happened twice while we both worked there. It was interesting. But the other thing is, if we're going to shape the board to be attractive to people younger than the silent generation, because even the baby boom, I mean, we can tell, I'm a boomer, we don't necessarily want to do it forever. But having a thoughtful conversation about term limits. And then how do you transition a board when you've got people who've been on forever? And you have to have a plan for that. So, potential board members chronically, and I think this is the bench. And are there people who declined or deferred? And who are the people who are not going to add a healthy contribution to our organization? Then, obviously, as you're vetting people and you're looking at skills, abilities, attributes, and willingness, helping the board chair know which committees people would be great for. But the board chair is ex officio to the governance committee, so you already know which committees need talent and what kind of talent. So this won't come as a surprise. So the rest of these, and in the 10 minutes we have left, I want to just do a run through the others, because you have the opportunity to go to sessions that focus on each one of these. But strategic planning, an interesting thing about strategic plans is they are a governance policy. They are not a staff document. Now, we are all smart enough to know a good strategic plan has to have input from the board and the staff. Otherwise, it runs the risk of being completely irrelevant. But it is not a staff-driven process that the board sees at the end and approves. It is not a staff-driven process that the board sees at the end and approves. This comes as a shock to some boards. They truly believe that the staff has to bring the strategic plan. Probably not. But at the end of the day, a good strategic plan will result in 2 action plans. An operating action plan, which is a business plan, and a governance action plan, which means the board's going to have to do stuff on its own. So if you're not expert at strategic planning, take that session in. The next one, protect your assets, manage resources wisely, and ensure fiscal oversight. This sounds like fiduciary, and it is. And I should say, this one, number 3, strategic planning, ought to be based in generative opportunities. What do we want our future to look like 10 years from now? And then, oh, by the way, what can we get done towards that in the next 3 years? Not 5, 5 is irrelevant. 3 is probably irrelevant. You can try for 3, but by the end of 24 months, you're redoing. Number 4, again, fiscal oversight. Why is the 990 important? Again, we're not doing a deep dive into that here. There are people here to talk about that with you. And if that's not something you're familiar with, it rolls out of your audit, and it's the compliance for the IRS. Adequate resources. Oh, this is every board member's favorite. Raise the money. Not hear that the staff raise the money. And Tom, your question earlier about life stage. In my experience, many directors are people of influence, leadership, and affluence who support very large, venerable institutions. And they are donors to places where staff in a development office call on them. But if you're a small, scrappy nonprofit, you don't have enough bandwidth to have gift officers on the ground. So the board has to take on your role. And that can become a really thorny thing in a small organization or in a transition. But one of the things with board recruitment, are you willing to open doors for us? Are you willing to walk through the door with us to do the cultivation conversations? If you can't get the ask out of your mouth, I'm good with that, I can do that. But if you're not in the room, and I've been picking on Eric and Tom, so let's pretend Eric and I are a team, soliciting a gift from Tom, and I'm the one who knows it. But I don't go to the meeting. What does that telegraph to Tom? She doesn't care enough about this thing to even show up. He's not thinking she's afraid to be in the room when Eric's talking about the ask. So think about the power of your presence. And when you look at other issues that major donors are looking for, obviously it's the service you provide, the space in which you work, but who are you actually serving? Not who you claim you're serving, what are the actual numbers? What's your mission, vision, values, and program? What outcomes do you create? Not what throughputs are you doing? What outcomes are you creating? How do you leverage relationships and networks and partnership? Looking at your governance structure, your executive leadership structure, that is often the first thing that a donor will want to look at. Who's on your board and who's running your business? That doesn't mean they have to know every name, but you have to be transparent about that and be proud of who's working with you. How are you communicating all of your outcomes and messages, and how healthy are you financially? Number 5, more, and you're going to talk a lot more about this if you go to the workshops on fundraising. But ironically, the transactional methods of fundraising the boards love are the least effective. The relationship tactics that boards don't want to be involved in are the least expensive to implement and raise the greatest number of dollars. It's part of taking the lessons and admitting, I didn't grow up comfortable with this. How can I get less uncomfortable with being part of relationship building and asking? It's taking that transactional Giving Tuesday donor to a face-to-face cultivation and stewardship discussion to do a mid-level gift, maybe a major gift, and hopefully an estate gift. So being willing to understand that. So 80% of the money often comes from 20% of the donors. I've seen it as high as 95.5, which isn't necessarily good, but it speaks to the way people are thinking today. Adequate resources, again, doesn't mean making sure the staff raises enough money. And if you go to those workshops later in the morning, you will hear more about this. Advocating and being an ambassador for your public reputation. Being willing to talk proudly about the work you do in an appropriate way. I'm a Rotarian. If the only thing I did was talk about the housing partnership when I'm at Rotary, they'd be running away screaming. So make sure you're appropriate in your advocacy. But are you advocating? Are you advocating with public officials? Are you advocating within your circle of influence? How are you positioning the brand of your nonprofit? And how are you inviting people to know more? Would you be willing to hear what we're up to? And when they say to you, oh, for heaven's sakes, Robbe, you just want money. No, I don't. At some point, you might decide you do want to make a gift. What I really want to tell you is how we're trying to be part of the solution to affordable housing in Chester County. I know there's a session today, 4 panelists doing a session on CEO recruitment. So if that's a thing you need to work on, try to take that one in. And when we look at all the duties and responsibilities of boards, think about that 3-part process. Is it fiduciary? Is it strategic? Is it generative? Are we working on all of those levels to make sure we maximize the skills, talents, insights, wisdom, the board as a powerful think tank? And when you do, making sure you're operating in the right mode at the right time. And as you go through the rest of the day, think about where your biggest areas of need are and take in those sessions, because you'll be sitting with experts who really can address and answer your questions. So the question for me is, have you chosen the right path? Are you keeping on, or are you really looking at evolving? And if you're needing to evolve, do you have the courage to call that out to me? So we have 2 minutes left for more questions. Would you consider turning the lights back on since the PowerPoint is no longer as important as I thought it was? But questions that you've got. And let me also say, if you want to email me a question, I'm very happy to get them. But put in the subject line, a question from the Nonprofit Institute. Because if you're like me, you get so much spam, you just delete stuff you don't recognize. So just do me that favor. Questions, comments, pushback, feedback, anything at all?
How did you cover that immense amount of material in exactly the right time?
I got really fast. But we also had some conversations.
We gave you the longest handout of the most stuff to cover, so
That
that
was
is,
all important.
it is important, yeah. Pro.
Questions?
What's your email address?
Yeah, it's on the first slide.
No, that's a website.
Oh, it's Robbe.Healey, R-O-B-B-E.
It's not on the cover page of your workshop?
She claims not.
That's just the.
Yeah.
It's just her website.
Yeah, it's Robbe.Healey, and Robbe is R-O-B-B-E, no I, thank you, mother. And Healey is H-E-A-L-E-Y, at AuroraPhilanthropic.com.
Yeah, it's on your picture too, on page what?
Page 27.
Oh, good. It's allegedly on
No,
page,
but page 27 doesn't have the emails.
it has my website.
Right.
Yeah, but my website's AuroraPhilanthropic.com, so just Robbe.Healey at.
.com.
Yep, .com. What other questions? You've been great, thank you. Thank you. And thank